The anterior pituitary is located below the hypothalamus in our brain, and it is neighboring to our posterior pituitary. Now, if we remember, we can recall that our posterior pituitary is also known as our neurohypophysis, meaning that it is made up of neurons and it is not able to produce its own hormones, and it relies on the hypothalamus to produce hormones and then transport it to the posterior pituitary, where the posterior pituitary will hold those hormones and then release them when the hypothalamus tells it to do so. Now, the hypothalamus is directly connected to the posterior pituitary, but the anterior pituitary is not directly connected to the hypothalamus. Instead, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are connected through the hypophyseal portal system. Remember that the portal system is essentially made up of capillary beds that are connected to one another so that two different areas can directly interact with one another instead of the signal or hormone traveling all the way throughout the body. For example, let's say the hypothalamus wants to release a hormone to interact with the anterior pituitary. If the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are not directly linked, the hypothalamus will have to release the hormone into the blood and hope that the blood can eventually transport that hormone or signal to the anterior pituitary. This isn't very efficient because that signal may not even reach that far into the anterior pituitary. So instead we have the portal system, the hypophyseal portal system, which essentially connects capillary beds through a system and allows that direct interaction between two different areas. So through the portal system, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary can interact with one another directly. Now, what's also important about the anterior pituitary, remember that the posterior pituitary was known as the neurohypophysis, whereas the anterior pituitary is known as the adenohypophysis, and that simply means that the anterior pituitary is made up of glandular tissue and is able to produce its own hormones, whereas the posterior pituitary, it was neurohypophysis, which means it was made up of neurons and it could not produce its own hormones. Now, since the anterior pituitary is able to release and produce its own hormones are still controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus actually tells the anterior pituitary when to release a hormone or when not to release a hormone. So essentially the hypothalamus has both inhibitory and releasing hormones. An inhibiting hormone, for example, let's say the hypothalamus releases an inhibitory hormone that tells the anterior pituitary to release some sort of inhibitory hormone or not to release a hormone. Whereas releasing hormones released by the hypothalamus will encourage the anterior pituitary to release some kind of a hormone. Now, the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary can either be tropic or direct hormones. So tropic hormones are essentially hormones that will target another endocrine gland, and that endocrine gland will release another hormone, and then that hormone will eventually reach the target area. Whereas direct hormones are hormones that are released by for example, the anterior pituitary, and they will directly reach the target. So the difference between tropic is that tropic will not directly reach its target. Instead, it goes to another endocrine gland, and that other endocrine gland will release another hormone that will eventually reach the target. Now here I'm quickly going to go over the hormones that are used to control the anterior pituitary and what the anterior pituitary releases as a result, and then we'll go into details about what each hormone actually does when it's released into the body. Now, first off, when the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, the key word over here is gonad. So remember that gonad refers to our female or male sexual organs. So the hypothalamus, when it releases the gonadotropin releasing hormone, that is passed on to our anterior pituitary via the hypophyseal portal system, and then the anterior pituitary will then release luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulizing hormone. But when the hypothalamus releases thyrotropin release hormone, or TRH, that causes our anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Now, when the hypothalamus releases corticotropin, or CRH, the anterior pituitary will then release adrenocortisotropic hormone, or ACTH. When the hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone, or GRH, the anterior pituitary will release growth hormone, or GH. Now, if we take a close look, whatever hormone the hypothalamus is producing to control the anterior pituitary, it has that RH, release hormone, in it. So we have RH over here, we have thyrotropin release hormone RH, and we have RH over here and RH over here. So we can remember that whenever we see this RH, release hormone, we know that this hormone is going to be produced by the hypothalamus and it's going to go control our anterior pituitary. And that whatever hormone is going to be released by the anterior pituitary, it's either going to be a direct hormone or it's going to be a tropic hormone. Now we'll take a closer look at the different types of hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. Now, remember that whenever the hypothalamus produces the gonadotropin releasing hormone, the key word being gonad, so it relates to the gonads of the males or females, the gonadotropin releasing hormone will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. Both of these hormones are tropic hormones, meaning that they do not directly target the target area. Instead, these hormones are going to target another gland, and that gland will produce another hormone, and that hormone will directly interact with the target area. Now, both of these are target hormones. The follicle stimulating hormone has two key functions. It is utilized in sperm maturation in males, so it helps that sperm maturation, and it also helps follicle growth in females. And follicle essentially means egg, so it helps with that egg growth. Whereas luteinizing hormone, also a tropic hormone, it helps in testosterone production and it stimulates ovulation in females. So once again, when gonadotropin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus, it goes to the anterior pituitary via the hypophyseal portal system, and then the anterior pituitary will either release follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone, which are both tropic hormones. Now, we also have two more tropic hormones. First up, we have the adrenocortisotropic hormone. Now, remember that when the hypothalamus, it releases cortisotropic releasing hormone, it's going to travel through the hypophyseal portal system and enter the anterior pituitary, which will then cause the release of adrenocortisotropic hormone. So tropic hormone, meaning it will not directly interact with its target area. Instead, it's going to target another gland, which will then produce a hormone, and that hormone will directly target the area. So the purpose of the adrenocortisotropic hormone is to target the adrenal cortex. We can see over here that it's not targeting a specific area, but it's targeting another type of gland, which will then release another type of hormone, which will then reach the target area. So this hormone, the adrenocortisotropic hormone, when it targets the adrenal cortex will then release glucocorticoids, which are utilized in times of stress by the body. Now, we also have a thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, thyroid stimulating hormone, remember that it will be produced by the anterior pituitary when the hypothalamus produces thyrotropin release hormone, which will travel through the hypophyseal portal system and then enter the anterior pituitary, which will cause the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Once again, it's a tropic hormone, so it's not going to directly interact with the target area. Instead, it's going to target another gland, and in this case, it's going to target the thyroid gland. And then the thyroid gland will produce T3 and T4, which will then go and target our target area. So once again, these are two more tropic hormones. Lastly, we have prolactin and growth hormone. Both of these hormones are direct hormones, so when they're released from the anterior pituitary, they will directly interact with the target area. Now, prolactin is utilized to increase milk production after childbirth, and it also stimulates the mammary gland development. And these two go hand in hand with one another. So once it stimulates mammary gland development, it's also going to stimulate milk production from those mammary glands. Then we have growth hormone or somatotropin. Now, it's also a direct hormone, so it will directly interact with the target area. And essentially, growth hormone, we can understand from the actual name that it's going to promote growth and cell and division amongst somatic cells. So these are going to be our non-sex cells. So once again, both of these are direct hormones. So another term for growth hormone is somatotropin. It's important to not confuse the word somatotropin with somatostatin. Remember that the term somatostatin is actually the hormone that is produced by the delta cells in our pancreas that regulate that inhibit glucagon and insulin. So remember that, don't confuse somatotropin for somatostatin. They have different functions and they are not the same thing. Now, a way to remember all of these different hormones, because I know remembering them can be kind of daunting and scary, but we can easily remember them through the acronym FLAT-PIG. Now, the F in FLAT-PIG stands for follicle stimulating hormone, L for luteinizing hormone, A for adrenocortisotropic hormone, T for thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, the flat in FLAT-PIG, all of these hormones are all tropic hormones, which means they will not directly interact with the target area. Instead, these hormones will target some sort of gland, which will produce another hormone. And then the P in PIG stands for prolactin, and the G stands for growth hormone. And these two hormones are direct hormones, so they will directly interact with our target area. And that's how we can remember all of the hormones of the anterior pituitary hormone. Now remember that the anterior pituitary can produce its own hormones, but it is still controlled by the hypothalamus.